Car battery. What about golf cart battery? Of course, battery from a G-Fob.
Absolutely. Well, good evening. We'll get started here in just a minute or two. Had some technology issues we had to work through, but I think we're about ready to go here in just a little bit. So good to see you. Thanks for joining us this evening. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and they were.
Maybe can't.
You're on.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are back to our routine. We have a nice group in person, and we have a group on Zoom. So thank goodness for Zoom, but the weather is not the excuse tonight because we have had a lovely day and a perfect temperature and no rain yet. So it's good. And and here comes Dan, so we can get started. He's early. Oh. I'm Millie Atkinson, and I have the privilege of serving on the board of the Areopagus. So Jeffrey asked me just to open the class tonight, and we have the next generation here with us. Thank you, from Spain. So I love it. We really need more of your age to be here for this topic. So thank you. Jeffrey's class on Sunday is going well, but of course the weather's been disruptive for 2 Sundays in a row, and I'm glad that we could get back together tonight for this. So great on Christian history and some well-known names that we should know about on Sunday mornings. So if you have an opportunity to do that. And then the only other thing for your C.S. Lewis fans out there, I was thinking about you all, Philip. I think it's February 19th. Jerry Root, who is from Wheaton. He's kind of a C.S. Lewis expert. He's going to be speaking out in Norcross with the C.S. Lewis Institute that night. So if anyone is interested in that at Lake Berkeley. And so I got that information.
Oh, and on Sunday morning, we'll start about a 6 or 7 week study of the life and works of Lewis.
Oh, okay. So that's okay. So C.S. Lewis will be one of the ones that we're studying on Sunday morning. So that would be a great complimentary topic if you want. I've heard Jerry Root before. He's excellent. I think some of you, we went out a couple of years ago. He was with Bill Smith there. So just lots of opportunities. And we live in an age, interesting times, but certainly we have a lot of information. We're really without excuse, as I like to say. So I will open us in prayer and turn it over to Jeffrey. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We are mindful that each and every day is a beautiful gift from you. We thank you for Johnson Ferry and welcoming us in this beautiful place, a warm room, even the technology. We thank you for Paul, who's here to just make sure everything goes well. And we do thank you for Jeffrey, and we just ask your blessing on him and for Dolly, for Kit at home as she's managing our Zoom group. Just so many things to be thankful for tonight. And we never take for granted the privilege of living in a country where we're free to worship you. May we just keep our focus on you, and please, by your Spirit, empower us to be the people you have called us to be for this moment in history. It is not a mistake that you have placed us here. So I pray that we will be in your ambassadors and to bring your light and hope into our area of influence. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. I'm gonna trip up.
You're free to worship as long as you're not St. Paul.
What's that?
You're free to worship as long as you're not St. Paul.
Oh, yeah. There's not much what they're doing up there.
Well, thank you, Millie, and good to see you all, and those of you joining us online as well. And I wish we had not had to cancel our class last week. That always creates problems. It breaks any momentum we had going. And also, well, as I think Millie might have mentioned, our Sunday morning class here at Johnson Ferry, the Sunday morning classes were called off for 2 consecutive weeks. So looking forward to restarting that. And as I mentioned, beginning this Sunday, we'll begin a pretty in-depth study of the life and works of C.S. Lewis. After that, we'll take a look at the life and works of Francis Schaeffer. We'll also delve into Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. Now, those are 4 of the most influential people in American Christian history. 3 of them we would classify as evangelical Christians. Lewis and Schaeffer and Graham. Martin Luther King is another matter. And so he made, of course, great contributions in terms of promoting the cause of equal rights, civil rights and all in American society, but theologically extremely liberal and politically very socialistic as well. But it'll make for a very interesting study nonetheless. So looking forward to that. And then as far as our Tuesday evening class here, I want to continue on. Hopefully we won't have any more interruptions in our schedule. Now, I wanted to start out considering all that's going on each and every day, each and every week in our society and culture. I want to read something and ask you, who is the source of this quote? Find it here. Okay, quote. Who said this? Okay, quote. There are those in the immigrants' rights community who have argued very passionately that we should simply provide those who are here illegally with legal status, or at least ignore the laws that are on the books and put an end to deportation until we have better laws. Now, I believe such an indiscriminate approach would be both unwise and unfair. It would suggest that those thinking about coming here illegally, that there would be no repercussions for such a decision. And this could, of course, lead to a surge in even more illegal immigration. The quote goes on, and it would also ignore the millions of people around the world who are waiting in line to come here to America legally. Ultimately, our nation, like all nations, has the right and it has the obligation to control its borders and set laws for residency and for citizenship. And no matter how decent some of these people may be, no matter their reasons for coming, they have broken our laws and should be held accountable. Okay, so who said this? You know, Obama, Barack Obama said this back in 2010. And of course, there was no significant opposition from the Democratic Party at the time. But
Right.
you see what's transpired, you know, in recent years and the utter hypocrisy of the situation. And so he actually deported. Do you know the number?
3 million.
No, it was supposedly, according to this, 11 million, supposedly. And again, no major resistance from the Democratic Party or the socialists or anything. And so you see how everything has flipped, and it's merely because of politics, and it's gross hypocrisy, to say the least. So we have an awful lot to contend with each and every day, and we need to pray for wisdom, and we certainly need to pray for more humility for our leaders today, starting with Donald Trump, because, you know, style does matter. Now, what matters most is substance. We all know that, but style also matters. And so we want to be as winsome in addressing these issues as possible without compromising, you know, our beliefs and our objectives and so on. All right, so let's since we've missed a session, and it seems like an awful long time since we last got together, let's go back just very, very quickly to the preface for this course. It takes us back 3 weeks ago. And we started off with a preface, America's Perennial Culture War. And I said that from the beginning, America has been a battleground between conflicting worldviews. From the beginning, this didn't start in the 1960s or even in the 1920s or anything. It was there from the very outset. And there are those who were motivated to come to America because they imagined that we could start a whole new civilization. Sometimes they would say that they came here to found a new Jerusalem. But there were also many who came here for totally different, you know, reasons. And you know, to contrast it with the idea of a new Jerusalem, they came looking for a new Babylon, okay? And theologically and philosophically, it was basically those who held to basic biblical theism versus those who were more secular humanistic in their orientation. And ideologically, it was liberty and virtue and individual responsibility versus libertarian individualism. And so we talked about this and how there's been this culture war going on from the very beginning, but it's intensified greatly in the last 100 years, actually, ever since the end of World War I. It started actually several decades before World War I, but it's intensified greatly over the last 100 years or so. And I think we all understand that this culture war that we experience each and every day, if you watch the news and so on, that's really just a surface level manifestation of the spiritual warfare that's going on behind the scenes. And that's why we can't be cowardly and just ignore it and try to, you know, duck away from the issues. It's two contrasting worldviews that just constantly are clashing in our society, our culture, and as exemplified again in the daily news and all. Now, we went from there to talk about the origins of America's culture war, and we talked about how that there's two socio-political ideologies that have emerged in American history over the last 150 or so years. One would be authoritarianism as a result of the influence of Marxism, socialism, and so on. We also, as you know, we have a very radical socialist who was elected mayor of our, well, traditionally greatest city, New York City. And so you have those who are pushing aggressively for authoritarianism, government control over every aspect of, or virtually every aspect of people's lives. And then on the other extreme, from authoritarianism, we have libertarianism. And what we've observed over the last 100 years or more is that the secular left, they are very, very clever. I would never say they're wise, not at all, but they are very, very clever. And as Aldous Huxley talked about in his book, Brave New World, this what we would call oftentimes neo-Marxist synthesis really combines authoritarianism and libertarianism in a very clever way. So, for instance, the secular left over the last century or so has really emphasized sex and drugs. And they realize that people that just surrender to those impulses are people that are not going to stand, for truth and morality in most every respect. So they are pushing for the liberalization of sexual laws, seen that our whole lifetime, drugs, and also, though, socialism. So they are, as I said, clever. Now, they want the government to control most aspects of Americans' lives, but they realize that an effective way of doing that is breaking down all inhibitions or moral restraints when it comes to sex and drugs and so on, because people like that are so easily led and misled. So, as I said, they're very clever people. And it's interesting how they combine these two extremes, libertarianism, or actually a better word for it is libertinism, and no moral restraints whatsoever. And then on the other hand, authoritarianism over so many aspects of our society and culture. Now, there's basically two cultural orientations at work here. Socially and culturally, contemporary America is divided into two general camps. You have conservatives, and then you have, of course, liberals or so-called progressives or socialists. Now, as we said a couple of weeks ago, there's also a third class of Americans. They're not conservative, they're not necessarily liberals, they're just selfists. They don't care about the culture. They don't care about politics or anything like that, the great issues of our day. They're just totally self-absorbed. And we see this played out in most of our elections in that conservatives and liberals are about equally divided in all of these elections. It fluctuates a little bit from election to election. But you'll notice that, about 30%, maybe 1/3 of the American people don't even vote, okay? They're so self-absorbed, they couldn't care less about anything outside of their own ego fulfillment and so on. So conservatives, liberals, and then selfists. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this really breaks down into two contrasting worldviews. You have those who hold to a generally theistic worldview that's based on absolute values and what correlates with what is objectively good and true and beautiful and so on. And then you have a naturalistic worldview that's rooted in relativistic and pragmatic affairs. And the gulf between these two worldviews grows wider all the time, and it's really the basis for the culture war that we witness each and every day of our lives. So we talked last week about two contrasting agendas for the founding of America. Donna and Ali both contributed to that. The motives for American colonization Religious liberty was a factor for many who came. They were always a minority, but they were a very influential minority. Then there were those who came primarily for political freedom, to get away from the rule of the king in England. You had those who came primarily for personal ambitions and social and economic opportunities. There were some who came primarily just for the adventure of it all. They wanted to get away from civilization and come where they could live their lives any way they pleased, especially once they left the small towns that were being developed early in colonial history. And you have those who basically were just libertine hedonists who came to America. So, excuse me. So this is sort of, these two distinct worldviews are pretty much displayed in the founding of the Plymouth colony in 1620. And then just 4 years later, the Mount Wollaston colony that was founded in 1624, just a few miles north of Plymouth. And so you had from the outset, really, a clash of worldviews. Those who came to establish in their minds a new Jerusalem, and those who came to establish a new Babylon, free of any restrictions, but their own, self-impulses and so on. So we talked about that, and the fact that from the beginning, America was beset by a culture war that represented two contrasting visions of what kind of a society and culture New England and the colonies in general would be. There was, for instance, those who came to set up a model Christian society governed by biblical principles of law and morality. They came to establish basically a refuge from the political, the religious, and the moral restraints of the old country. And for several generations, there was some sort of compromise worked out between those people who were mostly religious driven and those that were very secular minded. And the Christian religious heritage and values basically kept the more secular and the more libertarian Enlightenment agenda in check. However, the accelerated pace of change, especially in the 20th century, has increased the secularization of American society and culture, and the fissure separating these two worldviews widened until it opened up into a major chasm in the 1960s. And again, we're still feeling the effects of that as well. In fact, it's grown far worse than was the situation in the 1960s. So today, what we see are two broad camps representing absolutely irreconcilable worldviews. And I quoted Dennis Prager a couple of weeks ago, where he said, quote, America will be united only when one of these worldviews prevails over the other. You hear these naive people, pastors and church leaders and people in public life all the time talking about, oh, we have so much in common and, we just need to stop arguing among ourselves. They don't realize that there's two totally contrasting worldviews colliding, and they're totally irreconcilable. And I think Dennis Prager is absolutely correct. America will be united only when one of these worldviews prevails over the other. Any thoughts on any of that? And then we'll break some new ground here.
Again, talking about the culture war and how so many people don't even seem to be aware of it. There's a quote, and I can't pronounce his name, something like Huo Lang. He's a retired general in the Chinese Communist Army. And he says, quote, if one party is at war with another and the other party does not realize it is at war, party who knows it is at war almost always has the advantage and usually wins.
Yeah, we're constantly being told that we just need to be, as nice as possible and as polite. And obviously we are called by Christ to love others, but love doesn't mean we just capitulate to all of their impulses and their agendas and so on. True love, of course, can't be separated from truth itself. And yet, oftentimes, I mean, how often do you hear pastors and people in Christianity speak out on these matters? It's very, very rare, if ever. Okay? And so we need to do better in every respect. Any other thoughts before we move on here to early Christian influences in colonial America? Anything? Those of you joining us online, please don't hesitate to enter in. And it's good to see you all. All right. Well, hopefully you were able to download the outline for the first part of this chapter 2 in our study, Early Christian Influences in Colonial America. And so let's take a look here, beginning with the introduction there on page 1 of that outline. Two contrasting visions, the vision of a Christian commonwealth, talk a lot more about that. And then secondly, the social, political, and religious system that the founding fathers established under the Constitution. Okay. Now, again, what were the motives for English colonization? Well, Donna last week talked about, or the week before last, talked about the personal and economic motives that led many to come to America. Allie talked about the economic issues at stake, the political impulses of many who came, some coming for just a sense of adventure, some coming for religious reasons, and so on. And on page 2 of the outline there at the top, you see what I call the colonial potpourri. And what we have from the outset here in colonial America are those who are social, political, and religious dissidents. There are things about English society or some other country in Europe where they left before they came here. And they're looking for something more in keeping with their value system. We have a lot of people coming from England and other countries to America in the first century who were debtors, who were desperate. Many of them, of course, are going to come as indentured servants, and they'll work for X number of years, and then they'll gain their freedom and be able to establish themselves in American society, colonial society. No question that we get also the dregs of English society. But we also get people coming to America who are solid middle-class professionals, artisans, craftsmen, farmers, and so on. And that's a very healthy percentage of the American colonial population leading up to the time of the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, and then into the American Revolution era. Some of those who come to America from England are among England's best people, very industrious, very talented, and some are devout Christians. Okay? So you see the colonial potpourri there. Now, let's take a look at America's early religious diversity. And what we have are 3 general traditions. One is Roman Catholic. And of course, that had been the dominant religious faith in Europe for 1,200 years or so, leading up to the time of colonization. Now, as far as Catholic immigrants to America, it was just a small little trickle. And in fact, even at the time of the American Revolution, the estimates are that maybe about 2% of the American colonial population were Roman Catholics. So they're not too much of an influence. Far more would be mainline Protestantism. We'll talk about that in some detail. And then thirdly, you see the free church or nonconformist movement. And these are Christians who are not part of the established state churches in Europe or in England, the Anglican Church, Lutheranism in Germany and Scandinavia, for instance, and so on. We'll talk about how diverse that free church or nonconformist movement was. But let's start with Anglicanism, or later it's referred to in American history as Episcopalianism. And this is the Church of England. And how would you describe Episcopalian church government or an Episcopalian church structure? What sort of defines that in your mind?
Hierarchy.
Yeah, hierarchical, yes. As is the Roman Catholic Church. And so that's what we find in English Anglicanism. It's sacramentarian in its theology. Now, what do you derive from that term? What does it mean if you say there's a religious church or tradition that's very sacramentarian? What's that connote?
There are things that,
A lot of emphasis on the sacrament.
Yes. And Bruce?
that things have to do to be considered to be in good standing.
Yes,
So confession, communion,
right. Confession, communion,
you have to have
So-
last rites, you have, all.
last rites. So Anglicanism, in our minds, was really just kind of anglicized Catholicism. And it shares with the Catholic tradition a lot of the same basic premises as to what constitutes legitimate Christianity. So sacramentarianism and the emphasis on faithfully and regularly participating in the sacraments of the church. Now, what would happen to one if he did not do that? Well, at least in certain circles, the argument would be that he would lose his salvation. Okay. And so one of the arguments that Protestants, of course, have always used against Roman Catholics is that Roman Catholics believe that you're saved by works. And a primary aspect of being saved by works is your adherence to the sacraments, the holy sacraments. Okay. Now, how would a Roman Catholic respond to that? See, Protestants will argue, we believe that you're saved strictly by faith in Jesus Christ, repentance of your sins, and commitment to living, a Christ-centered life, and so on. And the sacramentarians would say, well, yeah, that's all important, but you also have to observe the sacraments, which means regular church attendance and, again, regular observance of the sacraments. So what would be the Catholic response when Protestants say, you people believe that you're saved basically by works, by, observing the sacraments and being loyal members of the church? What would be the Catholic response? Dan, any thoughts?
It's complicated. Catholics don't know basic Catholicism, so if we're just grabbing Joe Catholic off the street, you may not get any sort of, coherent answer. But yeah, it's kind of complicated.
Yeah.
The sacramental understanding, it has to do with, baptism puts new life in you, and you can deaden yourself to that new life. You can harden your heart, but basically a mortal sin basically would make that new life ineffectual for you. God hasn't gone anywhere, but you're now dead to him.
Yeah, well, many will say, no, we don't believe that you're saved by works. The works, in other words, adherence to the sacraments, those are acts of love. And you do those regularly because you're a true Christian. And so that's how Roman Catholics typically will respond to that argument by Protestants that, oh, you all believe in salvation by works. They'll say, no, we don't. We believe that you're saved by Jesus Christ, but works are basically just an expression of love for God, true love for God. Okay. Bruce?
But second Dan, I mean, it's a complicated thing, as we see all through the New Testament, that without works, you know, of faith, right? Your faith is nothing.
Mhm.
It'd
Mhm.
be symbol clanging, you know, so
Yes.
by their work that you will know me and things like that. So it's there too. It's the question of emphasis, but that's a very iffy thing. It's like trying
Yeah.
to predict what someone's motives are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's more complicated an issue than oftentimes Protestants make it out to be. Bill, real quickly, and we'll move.
Grace coming to the Catholic thing, grace.
Well-
Being born again.
Well, again, I mean, Catholicism has a very broad range of, perspectives and so on. But many Catholics will say, yeah, you're saved by faith, and by God's grace and faith in Jesus Christ and so on. But these are merely expressions of your faith. And if you're not following through with these expressions, then perhaps you're not really a true believer in the first place.
If I had a Catholic just flat out tell me, I don't need to be born again.
Well, there are some, yeah, that would argue that, and again, there is a range of opinion on a lot of that. Now, the last point,
Sorry.
Yes.
Dan said about how complicated it can get.
yes,
I was married to a Catholic for over 30 years.
mhm,
And she often spoke of the sin of presumption. So you
Hmm.
could not presume that you were saved, because that would bring pride into it.
oh, uh-huh,
So Dan is right, it's very complicated.
yes, yeah, yeah, and of course, in its 1,300 year, oh no, more than that, now it's 1,500 year history, there have been, again, constant debates and discussions about these matters. So there is a range of options, to say the least. Now, the last defining term you see there under Anglicanism or Episcopalianism is sacralism. Now, that's not a term that's used very often. It's not a very common term, but what would be your understanding of sacralism?
The intertwining of church and state.
Yes, uh-huh. It's not a theocracy where the same people who control the government are the same people that are church leaders. So there is a division of church and state, but they work together. And in fact, historically, what happens is that the church becomes more or less a department of state, and it really just carries out the wishes of the political leaders and so on. So that's basically sacralism. It's not theocracy, but it is this total integration of the two. Yeah, Bruce, and then we'll go to
Anglicanism had its roots in Henry's rupture with the Catholic Church, and Henry became the supreme leader of the church. I think. So the supreme leader of the church, not the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah.
With Henry.
Well, almost invariably, the political leader of the nation, the kingdom, the empire, whatever, will totally dominate the church. Occasionally there are exceptions in the history, but primarily that's how it operates. Dan?
It's down, but I find
Yeah.
it amusing that some of our friends on the ideological, political, so-called progressive left are often very absorbed with Scandinavia and European countries generally, believing that their mixed economy and their socialism is better than our less mixed economy and less socialism and stuff. And I always want to ask them, like, so you're okay with a state church and a big cross on the flag?
Yeah, yeah.
Which these countries have.
Yeah, they do. They still do into the 21st century. Many of them do. Yes.
Even if you have a different religion, you still your tax.
Right, right. All right. So Anglicanism is the state religion in England during the colonial era. And it has quite a strong influence here in America as well. For instance, all of the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, they all had an official state church, and it was the Anglican state church. And depending on local circumstances, a resident in Georgia or Virginia or the Carolinas could be very much discriminated against if you were not, a faithful, member of the Anglican Church. Now, in contrast to that, we have Puritanism. And Puritans, I define there as Calvinists, in other words, what we refer to generically as Reformed Christianity. They're Calvinists who sought to purify the Anglican Church. They believe that the Anglican Church was very worldly and needed to be revived spiritually and also organizationally. Basically, Puritanism is a holiness movement. Uh, and what you have under, for instance, Queen Elizabeth, who finished out the 1500s, King James the first quarter of the 1600s, his son and successor, Charles the First, you see the dates for him, basically the second quarter of the 1600s. They were very intolerant toward the Puritans. And you see there, I made a note of the Religion Act of 1592. Now, this was under Queen Elizabeth. She had not died yet at this point. And this was an act that was passed against what were called nonconformists in England. In other words, anybody who did not attend church services in the local Anglican church for 40 days, or who otherwise got together with other Christians that were unauthorized by the state church. People like that, according to the Religion Act, quote, shall be committed to prison without bail until they shall conform and openly submit to the authority of the state church. And violators could be exiled from England forever. So the official state church is not tolerant in England, as most all these official state churches in Europe were very intolerant toward anybody that didn't submit to their authority and all. And that certainly was the case here in England. Now, ecclesiologically, what about the Puritans? Well, for the most part, they practiced what we would call a Presbyterian style of church government. Now, how would you describe a Presbyterian style of church government? What is that?
Representative.
Yeah, it's representative church government. In other words, it's not a democracy. That's congregationalism, is a democracy, which theoretically that was, for instance, the Baptist movement was congregational or democratic. So it's not that at all, but also it's not a hierarchical system that's set up as in Anglicanism and as in the Catholic Church. And so, as Bruce rightly said, Presbyterianism is representative style church government. Now, that should ring a bell because that's precisely the form of state government that's later implemented here in America under the U.S. Constitution. Puritans are also, Bill?
Calvinism, Calvinist, were they part of the Church of England or opposite?
No. Calvinism was basically centered in Central Europe, Switzerland, and that area. And it also had a strong impact in Scotland as well. And so as you see there actually are two forms of ecclesiology or church government. One is Presbyterianism, the other is Congregationalism. Most of the Puritans in America were Congregationalists, but some, especially those who came from Scotland, practice Presbyterian style government. Now, there's also Puritan sacralism, again, the idea that in a well-run society and culture, there should be a dominant religious faith that basically runs the religious affairs of the nation. So just like the Catholics, just like the Anglicans, that would be their position as well. There's also a strong emphasis on education among the Puritans who come. We think of the establishment of Harvard College in 1636. That was only 6 years or so after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then about, 60 or so years later, 65 years later, we have the Puritans in Connecticut founding Yale College. And the interesting thing about the founding of Yale was that in that 65-year period between the founding of Harvard and the founding of Yale, many Puritans had come to the conclusion that Harvard College was drifting too liberal theologically and so on. And so Yale is actually founded as an alternative to Harvard theologically. But within just a few decades, it was every bit as liberal theologically as Harvard had been itself. All right, now let's move on to page 3 here, Presbyterianism. Well, again, primarily in American colonial history, the Presbyterians are Scots-Irish Calvinists. And as I mentioned a little while ago, they have a Presbyterian church polity, which means a Republican-style representative church government. And they also have quite an emphasis on education from pretty much from the outset. For instance, the College of New Jersey, later renamed Princeton College, was founded by Scots-Irish Calvinists for the most part. Another dominant strain in America is Lutheranism. And I think we all are familiar to some extent with Martin Luther and his doctrine of the 5 solas that he believed sort of structured the belief system of Lutherans. The 5 solas would be sola scriptura, that we are a Bible-centered, church movement. Solus Christus, in other words, Jesus Christ alone is the source of our salvation. Sola gratia, we are saved by God's grace. Sola fide, we are saved by faith in Jesus Christ and commitment to him. And soli Deo gloria, which means magnifying and honoring God in every aspect of life. So Martin Luther's 5 solas. As I say there, German immigration to America was the result of 2 centuries of religious conflict in Central Europe. The worst of these, and in fact, one of the worst wars in all of European history, was the 30 Years' War. You see the dates there, 1618 to 1648. Now, the 30 Years' War, estimates are that about 18 million Europeans perished during that war. That was a war fought between Catholics and Protestants. Again, it went on for 30 years. Now, there were various alignments of Catholics and Protestants. Sometimes some Catholics and some Protestants would align against some other group and all. So it wasn't so neatly divided, but nonetheless, it was a horrific war. And until World War I, it was probably the greatest and most destructive war in European history. Now, beginning in the second decade of the 1700s, we have Lutherans from Germany in general immigrating to America. And in fact, some of them were involved in one of the first efforts to plant a colony in Georgia, as you see there in 1734. Kind of the patriarch of American Lutheranism is usually identified as Henry Muhlenberg there, as you see as well. Now, Roman Catholicism. Well, how do we define Roman Catholicism? Well, 2 sources of authority. The Bible, as interpreted by the church magisterium, in other words, the church, authorities and all through the centuries. And then secondly, church tradition, as interpreted by the Pope and various church councils. So again, that's a clear mark of delineation between Roman Catholicism and most all Protestant and nonconformist groups as well. So two sources of authority. Distinctive beliefs. Roman Catholics have always held that they are the one true church. They are the mother church. Now, if you go into Eastern Europe and into parts of the Middle East, the Orthodox Church would make the same claim. And that is, no, it's not the Catholics centered in Rome, it's the Orthodox Christians who are the true church and the mother church, basically. And that accounts for a lot of the tension and conflict between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism throughout much of the Middle Ages. Now, Catholic soteriology, how does one become saved? Well, we've talked about that, okay? And sacramentarianism, an integral part of it. Observance of the sacraments, some will say, is evident. Those are just acts of love and thanksgiving to God, who is the source of our salvation. Catholic sacralism, well, obviously that's notorious throughout the Middle Ages, and that is this official state church that has no tolerance for anybody who will not submit to their authority. And here in America, the colony that's founded is kind of a haven for Catholics in England, will be the colony of Maryland. And so under the leadership of Cecil Calvert and others as well. So Maryland is founded basically as a haven for Catholics from Europe, but they can never, in the first couple of decades, they can't attract enough English Catholics to leave England and come to America. So under some sense of compulsion, they actually issue an act of toleration in 1649 that grants religious toleration to all Christians other than a few specific sects like Quakers, for instance, and some of the Anabaptist sects as well. Okay. All right, then if you turn over to page 4, the separatists and nonconformists, well, who are these people? They're countercultural Christians. They believe that true Christianity is countercultural because all political systems and social and cultural systems from the time of the first century on have been very, very corrupt in very certain ways. And so a true Christian is somebody who is so committed to following Christ that they are very resistant to adopting just the dominant beliefs and values and all of their mainstream society. So countercultural Christians. They reject the authority of the Church of England. These are sometimes called the Free Church, in that they are unaligned and they're not under the authority of the Anglican Church or any other established state church. And their soteriology, they say, well, we just strictly follow the Bible. And church tradition is so flawed that it's not a worthy guide for how we believe and how we live our lives. We're strictly Bible-centered. Now, you see that they're harassed and persecuted under Queen Elizabeth and under her successor, King James I. And among these nonconformists would be the people that we refer to as the Pilgrims, who founded Plymouth Colony in 1620, William Bradford and others, as well. Now you see there that I included a quote, separatist sacralism. Remember what sacralism is? It's this idea that there should be a state church that controls, our religious beliefs and practices and so on. So you see the quote there from Williston Walker, who wrote a history of the Congregational Churches, in which he writes, quote, neither the Pilgrims nor the Puritans, who we've talked about, had any thought of establishing liberty for men to do as they pleased. nor would any general toleration, such as we now justly value, have furnished motives definite enough to have led our ancestors to the New World. So his point there is that even nonconformist Christians, for the most part, there are a couple of notable exceptions, but most nonconformist Christians back in these days had no sense of religious freedom, religious liberty. They believed, like the Catholics, like the Anglicans, and everybody else, that their views on the Christian faith were the one true belief. And so, why would you want to invite into your colony people who were heretics? And so they didn't believe that religious toleration was a virtue. In fact, it was a vice. Because what is it that you're tolerating? Well, you're tolerating people that are heretics and hardly Christians at all, but they claim to be Christians. So that's true among the Pilgrims who founded Plymouth. It's true among the Puritans who founded Massachusetts, and it was just pretty much universal in that day. Any thoughts on any of that? Okay, and then we have a group here that perhaps you've heard of, and this is called Baptists. And so, what are the defining features of the Baptist faith? Well, they differ from most all other Christians in that they believe in believers' baptism, not infant baptism, and baptism by immersion, not sprinkling or pouring or whatever. They also really emphasize the priesthood of all believers, someone who truly has the Holy Spirit in residence in their heart is a priest as much as somebody who's sanctioned, in a position of authority in the church. They basically hold to a congregational church polity. In other words, the members of a church are the ones who should decide, what to believe and how to practice your faith. At least that's in theory. But congregationalism rarely ever works, just like democracy rarely ever functions efficiently. But that was one of the bases on which the Baptist movement was founded. Church autonomy. Every Baptist church is independent. And so they need to follow God's leading to the best of their ability. And they're not so restricted by associations with other churches as well. It's also different from a lot of these sects that we've talked about in that it's non-liturgical. The primary emphasis is on the Bible, expository preaching, and spontaneous prayer instead of formal written prayers and formal liturgy and so on. Soteriology, they are non-sacramentarian. In other words, Baptists believe that the Lord's Supper and baptism are merely, what's the term that's typically used? Yeah, they're merely ordinances. They're not sacraments, okay? And salvation comes by divine grace through faith in Jesus Christ and commitment to him. They are anti-sacralistic in that they emphasize religious freedom and separation of church and state, a very radical notion back in those days. Now, it's not actually referred to as separation of church and state until the time of Thomas Jefferson, but it's the same principle there, and that is that the church should be independent of the state and vice versa, for that matter. Baptists in America, you see Roger Williams, John Clark, and those who founded Rhode Island. We'll talk about that more in a little bit here. And as you see there at the bottom, Baptists and other nonconformists were usually taxed to support the official established state churches, such as the Congregational churches, the Puritan churches, and Anglicanism, and so on. But that's a cause of great concern and a lot of tension in colonial society. Okay. All right, and then we have the Quakers, who really don't refer to themselves as Quakers. That was actually a pejorative term that was used for them, in that they would become so very, very emotional, oftentimes in their prayer services. And so critics would call them Quakers. And then there was a similar group that also arose in England back in those days. They didn't associate with Quakers, but they had similar mannerisms, so they were referred to as Shakers. And there were some Shakers that came to America as well, but they were a tiny minority. But let's take a look here real quick at the Quakers. It's founded by George Fox in 1647. So 1647, well, that's only about 17 years after the founding of Massachusetts Bay. It's only about, 27 years after the founding of Plymouth Colony, and it's about 40 years after the founding of Jamestown Colony. George Fox believed that all institutionalized denominations, from the Catholics to the Lutherans and, everybody in between, were heretical and were illegitimate. So he would put forth the source of authority as being two matters: the Bible, but the Bible is interpreted through the internal guidance of the Holy Spirit, which they called the inner light. Okay, so that's one of the defining features of the Quaker movement. In terms of salvation, soteriology, they would argue that true Christianity is not a formal institutional religion. It's a very personal, it's a very existential relationship with God through the indwelling power and presence of the Holy Spirit. True Christianity is countercultural, and oftentimes they would cite, for instance, Romans 12, 1 and 2, don't be conformed to the value system, the dominant ways of thinking and living and so on of this world, but be transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, in terms of their how they operate their churches, their ecclesiology, they are very non-liturgical. They're very informal, and they put quite an emphasis when they gather together on quietude and meditation. So unlike almost all these other denominations and so on, when Quakers met, oftentimes it would be just total silence for the entire hour, hour and a half, or however long they met, as it's all about communing with God internally. And so there's rarely ever a formal teaching or a formal preaching associated with it. No pre-planned sermons, no pre-planned music. Everything, they would argue, must be spirit-led. Okay. It's also, like the Baptists, anti-sacramentarian. In fact, they go beyond the Baptists in that they do not believe that converts have to be baptized. And they also, in many Quaker congregations, they would never even celebrate communion. So they associated all of that with Catholicism and mainline Protestantism and so on. You see some radical social doctrines that they were known for. Pacifism. They believe that true Christians should not be taking up the sword and killing others for any reason, including in some cases even self-defense or defending their families and all. So pacifism, simple living. They were not all caught up, in increasing their wealth and status and power in society. They believed that was very unchristian. Now, radically, they believe in female equality. They're just about the only Christians who held to that. And also, they're in a tiny minority in that they believe that slavery is a sin under any condition whatsoever and needs to be abolished. So the Quakers very distinct from all the other Christian groups at the time. And you see there Quakers in America. William Penn founds Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers, but also he invites other persecuted Christian groups as well, like the Mennonites, the Amish, Moravians, and many others, Dunkers, and other groups as well. And he also is a great promoter of religious freedom, even for Roman Catholics, and the separation of church and state. So distinguishing characteristics there of the Quakers. Okay. Now we have the Anabaptists. And when we think of Anabaptist, by the way, that doesn't mean anti-Baptist. It means
Hey,
rebaptizers.
I had a quick question about the Quakers.
Yes, Janet. Mhm.
Are any of you aware of the current movie that is out about the Quakers? It's called The Testament of Anne Lee. It's actually in the movie theaters right now.
Oh, so it's supposedly based on the historical Anne Lee,
Yeah, at the
a leader in early Quakerism.
yeah.
No, I've not heard of it. What
And I've
about it?
watched the trailer, so it's at the time period where they must come to America. They travel somewhere, and it's
Mhm.
yeah. So
Mhm. Well, that would be interesting to see and just check it with the historicity of the Quaker movement. Hopefully it's fairly accurate,
it's at the
terms.
theater near the church. But yeah, I'd be interested in going to check it out too
Yeah,
if anybody else wanted to.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, my beloved wife, so why don't you contact her and we'll arrange a time to get together and go see it.
Will
Yeah.
do. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's good. I'd love to see that movie. And again, check it against what we know about the real, history of the Quakers and all. All right, the Anabaptists. Well, it's a variety of different sects, although it's usually characterized by Mennonites primarily and the Amish, but also the Hutterites and other groups as well. And back in the 1500s, at the outset of the Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptists were referred to as the radicals of the Reformation. They believed not in simply reforming some of the aspects of mainstream Christianity, but in restoring New Testament Christianity as they understood it. And the Mennonite sect, which was the dominant sect among Anabaptists, was named in honor of Menno Simons, one of the great spiritual leaders of the 1500s. It's anti-sacralistic, of course. They don't believe in any kind of alliance of church and state. They believe in religious liberty and so on. And as far as some of their distinctives, they believe that the primary source of authority should be the Bible, but it's not the Bible as interpreted individually, or as the Quakers put it, by the inner light, the inner Holy Spirit, in each true believer. But rather, the Mennonites believe this is the Bible is interpreted by the community of believers. And the idea here is that we're all self-centered individuals, and we can easily distort truth just to suit our own agenda. And so we need to think about our faith and live our faith in accord with those who are part of our, congregation or are part of our Christian community, and they can help correct some of our worst impulses. So it's an interesting concept, and I think probably a very sound contribution by the Mennonites. The Bible is interpreted by the community, not individually. And of course, they believe, like Baptists, in believers' baptism and so on. It's non-sacramentarian. If you look at page 6 there, they hold to pacifism. In fact, they were slaughtered by the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands, slaughtered all through the 1500s by Catholics, but also by Protestants in some cases as well. Protestants considered them to be arch heretics, and so did the Catholics. Okay. So again, being primarily pacifistic, there were a few exceptions, but overwhelmingly they were pacifistic. They were just, very, very prone to be exploited and even, in many cases, eliminated by their rivals. They believe in simple living and intentional community. They hold to what's called the free church model, and that is like the Baptists, that each church should be, independent and so on. And you have there again, you see the Mennonites, the Amish, Hutterites, and others as well. Then you have tiny little denominations or groups of Christians, primarily that come out of Central Europe, Germany, and all. You have the Dunkers, for instance, and the Moravians. The Moravians played a role in the founding of Georgia Colony originally. In fact, they had an influence on the conversion of John Wesley, in fact. And I did a little bit of research several years ago, and I found out that there is a Moravian church here in Metro Atlanta. It's kind of in the Stone Mountain area.
Wow.
And sometime if I ever have a free Sunday, I'd like to go and
I want to
check
go.
that out.
I'm sorry, I want to go. Because
All right.
didn't the Moravians descend from Jan Hus?
No, that's the Hutterites. That's
Oh,
the
I thought it
Hutterites.
was the Moravians.
No, you see there in the notes there, it's a pietistic sect that started out as kind of generic Lutherans, and it's founded by Count Nicholas Zinzendorf. And again, they believe that the Lutheran Church was too formalistic and liturgical and so on. And so their emphasis was on personal transformation, as I say, through spiritual rebirth and renewal and so on. And you see, they come to Georgia in 1735
Wow.
aboard the same ship as John Wesley. And then George Whitefield later offers them land in Pennsylvania, so they leave Georgia and move up to Pennsylvania. So the Moravian sect, okay. Page 7, you see a very controversial sect, believe in communal living and social and spiritual equality, and the other features there. The Holy Spirit, in fact, they would claim, is actually a feminine expression of the deity. And they do hold to female equality, the right of women to preach, which is very rare, of course. They're pacifists, and they also are anti-racists, like the Quakers and some Baptists and some other groups as well.
Moravians?
Yes, yes, this the Moravians, yes. All right, and then Methodism. And so let me check how we're doing here for time. I think we're going to just pick up at this point again next week, because I'd like to turn things over to Bruce for the remaining time we have. You see, if you leaf through the outlines, we'll talk a bit about Methodism and then Christianity in the colonies. We'll talk next week about the founding of the Jamestown colony, the Plymouth colony, and then Rhode Island. And so I know Bruce went to a lot of time and effort to prepare a presentation on Rhode Island, the founding of Rhode Island and the Baptist movement in America. So I'd like to give you ample time, and we do have about 16, 17 minutes. So
I mean, I've been 170 words a minute.
So why don't you close us out, and then we'll go back and pick up where we left off next week.
I will actually not be talking about the forum founding the Baptists, but that's okay. Yeah, they get it there. See if this is working. Is this turning on? No. That's not a touch screen.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, that's his. Sorry, it's his.
Does it work?
I guess it will. Okay.
Good, should be good.
Okay, Roger Williams' A Life. This is drawn from a book by John Barry called Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty. It was actually a tremendous find in the half-price bookstore. It started me off on a whole thing with Roger Williams. This comes from a longer presentation. I did almost a full hour on this in some class way back. And that was about almost 8,000 words. And Jeffrey said, well, can you do Roger Williams? I said, well, I've got 50 minutes and 8,000 words. So no, you need 15 minutes, which is just 2,400 words. So the hours of arduous work have been mainly the machete. Take this out, take that out, take this. I really want to say that. No, you can't say that. But that's how it worked. These are not all the slides from the original presentation, but most of them. Sometimes you'll see bullet points that aren't in my text, right? But they'll be relevant to the thing, so you can just read them and take them for what they're worth. I think you'll enjoy it. Well, this doesn't work.
That's the screen.
Huh?
That's the screen. Yeah.
Touch the screen.
Another.
I got turned on. All right, there we go. Jeffrey takes over technology. This is a miracle to take in this room. Right? All right. Hey, I'm down to 14 minutes. While there is no contemporary images of Roger Williams, several are current in our collective memory. Primarily, there's a statue in Rhode Island. Beyond that, there's not very much. So without further ado, let's get going. Part 1. Birth and formation in England in the early 17th century. Understanding Roger Williams begins with Sir Edward Coke. He was the finest judicial mind of his generation and held almost every important position in the royal government. He single-handedly distilled what became English common law for generations of precedents. Around 1616, Williams caught Coke's attention because Williams was taking notes in shorthand, which was a skill which was just being revived at that time. Coke took Williams under his wing and with him into high-level government meetings to take notes for some years. It's hard to imagine a better position for an inquisitive mind to absorb the law and government. He saw Coke and his rivals maneuver around each other in a constant scramble for superiority at court. And of course, he learned the law and a lot of philosophy and stuff as well. Coke sent Williams first to Charterhouse School, where he excelled in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Williams continued to Pembroke College, Cambridge. But by early 1620, the Pilgrims had left for America. Williams graduated from Cambridge, but as a Puritan, he was refused a clerical position in the Anglican Church. He found refuge as a private chaplain to the head of a wealthy and influential Puritan family in the northeast of London, putting himself at the heart of Puritan political and religious activity. But when William Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, he began pursuing Puritans with a vengeance. When interrogation of private chaplains for Anglican conformance began, are you using the right prayer book? Are you dressing in the right garments? All this sort of stuff. Williams knew that he would not fare well in such an examination. So on December 1st of 1630, in the teeth of winter, mind you, with his new wife and what he could carry of his library, he boarded line in the dead of winter to cross the North Atlantic, bound for America. Arrival in America, Boston and Plymouth and back. Williams and his wife arrived in Boston on February 5th, 1631, after a very tempestuous voyage. I mean, the smells and the poor hygiene below deck was impossible. And on deck, you could be killed by falling ice from the riggings. It just was not good, right? They watched a young man fall overboard and they couldn't turn around and watch him for 15 minutes till the sea finally sucked him in, you know. His initial reception was very positive, but the situation, the plantation was desperate. Food was scarce, and Governor Winthrop had just given away the last of his private food stores. The church offered Williams a very important position as theologian, but Williams took his time meeting with church officials to understand what they believed and how they ran their church and what their relations were with civil society. He did not like what he heard, ultimately telling them, "I durst not officiate to an unseparated people." His response offended as much as astounded. Even Winthrop agreed that the English church was defiled, but separation was a bridge too far. Winthrop's government enforced the 10 Commandments, but Williams believed that the magistrates had no authority over the first table of the law, the initial 4 commandments governing man's relationship to God. The remaining commandments, sometimes called the second table, regulated man's behavior toward his fellow man, and those could be in the purview of both the magistrates, the government officials, and the church. This position would cost Williams for the rest of his life, and the repercussions quickly began. First, he was off to Salem. Salem, 20 miles to the north, was older and poorer than Boston, but not free of pride. They were pleased to have someone who had put Boston in his place and offered him the position of pastor. But Boston, never missing a trick, you'll see, was not happy and put pressure on Salem to withdraw the offer. Somewhere in early 1631, Roger Williams and his wife departed for the entirely separate colony of Plymouth Plantation, the lower red arrow there. Plymouth was surviving but not thriving due to limited geographic resources. Williams became a farmer, a daughter was born, and he traveled extensively through the region, trading and developing relationships with local Indian tribes. He became an unpaid assistant professor, unpaid probably to avoid antagonizing Boston. In consequence, in correspondence between Williams and Governor Winthrop in Boston, we find this quote: "I am no elder in any church, nor shall I ever be, if the Lord please to grant my desires, that I may intend for what I long after, the native souls." Converting the Indians had been one of the most important justifications for every effort to plant colonies in America, but in 25 years, none had made much in the way of significant progress. Several ideas motivated the colonists with regard to the Indians. First, preventing them from becoming Roman Catholics. The French and the Spanish had sent priests to convert them. And preaching the gospel is a precondition for Christ's return, which is a premillennialism, whatever. Yeah, you have to gospelize. You have to preach the gospel to the whole world before Christ will come back. And finally, oddly enough, many Puritans believed the Indians were the lost tribes of Israel. You know,
Joseph Smith.
Yeah, Joseph Smith. Okay. While Williams did not romanticize Indians, he saw them as equals in their humanity. From there, it was but a short step to realizing that the Crown's awarding of land based on its being unused was not justified. Indians deserved compensation. Plymouth leaders asked him to write a treatise explaining these ideas, but it has been lost. 2 years after leaving Salem, he asked to be formally separated from the Plymouth Church, after which he and some followers returned to Salem. Litigation and exile, the founding of Rhode Island, and the Pequot Wars. Things were turbulent in the Bay Colony. Williams was ordered to appear in Boston to explain his views. As a result, he was ordered to surrender his pastorate in Salem, and finally resulted in banishment from the colony. The court delayed his departure due to illness, but Governor Winthrop, who was friendly to Williams, warned Williams of plans to arrest him and send him back to England, almost certainly to the threat of execution. When the posse arrived, he'd been gone for 3 days. Williams had entered the forest in a blizzard, both ill and alone. He made for the Wampanoag, a tribe he had known well for many years. But he never lost the impression of having been turned out by what should have been his brethren, only to be cared for and protected by the barbarians. Hardest to bear was to be pursued by letters from John Cotton, pastor of the Boston Church, condemning him in no uncertain terms. In the spring, Williams selected Seekonk on the eastern shore at the head of Narragansett Bay. That's the red arrow up top. A handful of men arrived from Salem to join him, but Massachusetts put pressure on Plymouth to expel Williams, claiming that the land was actually part of the Plymouth land grant. Plymouth complied. Everybody complied with Boston pretty much. Plymouth complied, and Williams, with no power to resist, removed his small band to the opposite bank of the river at the head of Narragansett Bay, to a place later to be called Providence. This included leaving behind the buildings and unharvested crops that they had planted at Seekonk. The lower red arrow points to a Quidneck Island, formerly known as Rhode Island. It will feature in our story very shortly. He was now completely outside Plymouth's grant, but in Narragansett territory. They were the most powerful tribe in the region and traditional enemies of the Wampanoag and the Pequot. But Williams knew their leaders from previous trading relationships and received permission to settle there. He wanted his settlement to be a haven for those distressed of conscience, and it soon attracted dissenters. One of the reasons that the Bay hated it so much is every kook in the world went to Rhode Island. In 1637, a group also exiled from the Bay were allowed to purchase a Quidneck Island and establish the settlement of Portsmouth, but it proved to be an uneasy relationship. The threats of a Pequot War had broken out in 1636. They were just to the left of the Narragansett, to take up arms against Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Connecticut colonies. The colonists were duly concerned. There were some 50,000 Indians and 10,000 colonists. Yeah. And so we, in America, we have 10,000 colonists. There are 10,000 colonists. The Bey contacted Williams, asking his help in warding off an alliance between the two tribes. The people who banished him, right? The irony of asking a man banished by the Bey to become its agent at the risk of his life could not have escaped either of them. At one point, he was the only man, the only white man at a powwow of Narragansetts and Pequot, about 3,000 or 4,000 warriors, all by himself, right, negotiating on behalf of the Bey. Ultimately, the Narragansetts trusted Williams more than they did the Pequot, and no alliance was formed. In his lifetime, there was never any recognition from the colonies as to Williams' help. Nice bunch, right? The return to England and a new charter, twice. Williams was able to keep peace between Providence and the Narragansett for nearly 40 years, but during that time, Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut would exert pressure on Rhode Island to try to undermine and destroy it. In 1643, these three colonies formed a military alliance called the United Colonies, which excluded the towns around Narragansett Bay. In response, William set off to England to secure a stronger charter for the colony. Now, the English Civil War had begun in 1642, so England was already in flames when he got there. What would one man be able to do? Williams had his 2-month journey to devise a plan. He saw his knowledge and relationship with the Indians as his pathway to attention and cooperation among the English elites. So throughout the voyage, he poured his knowledge of America's Indians into what would become a key into the language of America. In addition to the language, the book addressed customs and religions of the North Americans. He was playing on the fact that in Europe, especially in England, there was a great deal of interest in these people, although nothing had really been done by any of the colonies that had come before. On arrival, Williams contacted Sir Henry Vane, who had briefly been governor of the Bay. He was actually the most highly titled man to ever come to the colonies, right? He'd been the governor, and he'd developed a lifelong friendship with Williams before he went back to England. Vane introduced William to none other than John Milton's printer, who would print all of Williams' publications until the printer himself was forced to flee to the colonies. Key appeared in 1643 and became immediately popular. Williams began to pamphlet, refuting the ideas both that much had already been done for the Indians or that they were not ready to hear the gospel. But back in America, things were unstable. The United Colonies had given permission to one tribe to execute a Narragansett leader who had been very close to Williams. The settlers on Aquidneck tried to lay claim to the land that was in Providence Plantation. Connecticut, too, made groundless claims to parts of Providence and much of Narragansett land. Massachusetts, never to be outdone, used the resulting disputes to claim jurisdiction over the whole region. The aggressiveness of Massachusetts energized Plymouth, which itself began exploring ways to expand into Rhode Island territory. Everyone in the plantation felt at risk. Our biographer puts it this way: all the settlements of Rhode Island, both on the island and on the mainland, were outcast societies. None had economic, political, or military power. They could not protect themselves. They needed the legal authority that only a patent, a charter could give them, with a power behind it strong enough to intimidate the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth, and Connecticut. Such authority and such power could come only from England. Their only possible protection lay in England. The bottom line seemed clearly to be that without a royal charter, Providence Plantation was likely to be dissolved. But in England, Parliament, Civil War going on, right? Basically Parliament against the royalty. Parliament, though preoccupied with its own survival, eventually established a committee on foreign plantations. But the bad news was that the sentiment was moving away from, rather than toward, any toleration of religious differences. Yet here was Williams going in exactly the opposite direction. Williams needed a cause to make his ideas come to life, and that cause was John Cotton, the Boston pastor who had harassed him by letter as he fled through the wilderness when he was banished. Williams had Cotton's letter reprinted with his reply entitled "Mr. Cotton's Letter Examined and Answered." He took Massachusetts to task for blurring the line between the church and the state. Of most interesting are Williams' words here: "When they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broke down the wall itself, removing the candlestick," Revelation, "and made his garden a wilderness as at this day." In other words, mixing church and state corrupts the church, or In more modern terms, when you mix politics and church, you will always get politics. Finally, the Committee on Foreign Plantations agreed to formally hear William's petition. It passed the table, as they said. On March 14th, 1644, Williams had his charter signed by some of the most powerful men in England. The charter allowed for a fully democratic government, an extraordinary liberty for its day. And even more extraordinary, all decisions about religion were left to the majority. Anticipating his departure, Williams was editing a final parting shot. This was the bloody tenet of persecution for cause of conscience, discussed in a conference between truth and peace. It called for true freedom of religion and absolute separation of church and state, presented not as a complaint from one sect or denomination, as these views, if they were ever heard, came, right? But as a general condition of mankind. And it was full of scripture, for upon that rested William's case for separating the civil and religious power. He left the anonymous manuscript to be published by Dexter, but he was soon known as the author. But by the time Parliament ordered the burning of all copies, Williams was at sea, headed for America, Providence, and home. Williams arrived in Boston on September 17th of 1644 with letters from powerful Englishmen that he be granted safe passage. But Mass Bay, never missing a trick, ignored them and ordered him to leave immediately. He traveled by land from Boston, and on reaching Narragansett Bay, that was a journey in itself, right? Climbed into a canoe to cover the last few miles. He was greeted by a fleet of 14 canoes. They had come to pay tribute, friends and former enemies alike, knowing what he had accomplished against seeming insurmountable odds. He was enthusiastically cheered. Our biography says, this embrace by neighbors was the first such greeting he had ever received, and the emotion overcame him. He was finally home. It took several years for Williams to get the 4 towns around Narragansett Bay to unite under a single government. One William Coddington, a local major figure, went to England and received a patent as governor for all of life over Aquidneck Island. In response, Providence dispatched Williams to England again to get Coddington's commission canceled. Williams sold his only source of income, his trading post, sailed to England, managed to get Coddington's appointment canceled, returned in 1654, and was elected president, subsequently serving in many positions in the town and colonial government. Part 5, More Indian Wars, Death and Legacy. In 1675, King Philip's, an Indian name, King Philip's War broke out, pitting the colonists against Indians with whom Williams had always maintained good relationships. It was a bitter time, especially the burning of Providence, including his own home. The war ended in 1676, and Williams died in the early months of 1683 at approximately age 80 years. His body was buried on his own property, but 50 years later, the house collapsed into the cellar, and the location of his grave was forgotten. In 1860, the National Park Service dug up the spot, finding only nails, teeth, and bone fragments. A statue was placed in Prospect Terrace Park. But America had been profoundly changed as a result. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. What's the most impressive thing about Roger Williams in your mind?
Oh gosh, I mean, they once said that Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, was the most bought and least read book in the world. And I think the story of Roger Williams is at least understood and one of the most fascinating, right? That this man was had such a strong center, right? That he could face almost anything, right? Can't imagine. Remember, when he got to Boston, there were no inns. There was no place to stay. He had to stay at homes with the people there. He goes and says, "No, I'm sorry, I couldn't possibly serve a group of people who were not removed." You know, that's what he ended up going to Salem, right? They had this idea that the Indians should receive compensation for their land, and that would have been a non-starter in England, let alone in the colony.
Yes.
You know, it was really quite exciting. He learned several Indian languages in the course of his life, which of course strikes a chord with me, having dabbled in languages a lot of my life, but just a phenomenal man of phenomenal spirit.
Yeah, really one of the most extraordinary people in all of American history. Yeah. He thought, oh, by the way, this issue of separation of church and state, as we all know, I think, that concept has been totally perverted over the last 150 years, beginning in the late 1800s. not just recently, but all the way back, not long after the American Civil War, that concept of separation of church and state. And secularists and those who had anti-Christian biases would use that term to try and, as you know, exclude any Christian influence from society whatsoever. And that was not even remotely the concept that Roger Williams supported, nor was it what Thomas Jefferson, who was no Christian, but Thomas Jefferson, when he emphasized separation of church and state, he had a similar view on it as Roger Williams. And that is, no, he wasn't promoting secularism in American society, but it was this idea of the church and state, the institutions being connected, in which case the state, as you emphasize, always dominates in that relationship and perverts the church, basically.
Not to romanticize. Rhode Island was not what you would call a smacking success. And people from all these different religious and southern marginalized areas.
Oh, you want to come over?
I mean, you wouldn't say that Rhode Island was a shining success. I mean, it opened up with a lot of risk, and they brought people from all over the place. Everybody around them hated them for their peculiar ideas and so forth and so on. So they weren't about to give it any help. Hard enough to live in the wilderness without having armed people, Indians and colonists who were not helping you trade and standing in your way and so forth and so on. And so it was a difficult place. But the old joke was that Roger Williams would accept anybody except Quakers.
Yeah, that's right. He did draw the line
He didn't
on
like the
Quakers.
like the Quakers.
And I think he actually even allowed Jews, just very few Jews who were in the colonies at the time to come and live in Rhode Island. But anyway, a really, really exceptional individual. So thanks for your presentation. So next week we'll pick up at this point. We'll go back into your notes and fill in some of the most pertinent aspects in those pages before Rhode Island. I know Donna's going to present on which colony? Yeah, Plymouth Colony, that's right. And Allie will be talking about Jamestown, the founding of Jamestown, the first of the English colonies as well. So we'll spend another session or so on this topic before we move on. So good being with you. Those of you who joined us online, great to have you with us as well. Hopefully we won't have any more interruptions weather-wise in our schedule, and we can continue the momentum that we began this evening. So great being with you. Blessings on your week. Yeah, thank you.
God bless you all. Bye.
One more day.